And we're back at the U.S. Library of Congress. The library, founded in 1800, was first house in the U.S. Capitol until it got its own building, now named after Thomas Jefferson.
Right, and Jefferson was the main author of the Declaration of Independence, as we've discussed, but he was also the nation's third president and a lifelong slaveholder.
Which is kind of ironic, but Jefferson owned hundreds of slaves, yes, it's true, at his Monticello estate in Virginia, despite being an opponent of the slave trade.
Right, and that's what's most interesting, is that Jefferson actually thought that slavery was harmful to both the slaves and their masters, but he indeed did own slaves himself for his entire life. Now, several exhibits have explored this moral conflict of Jefferson's, and earlier this year, VOA's Julie Taboh went to Monticello to find out more. Let's take a look.
Thomas Jefferson lived much of his life at Monticello, a sprawling plantation near Charlottesville, Virginia. But although he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he owned 600 slaves during his lifetime. That contradiction is the subject of two groundbreaking exhibits, one at Monticello. Hundreds of African-American slaves and their families lived here, and they labored for Jefferson's enterprises. Susan STEIN is senior curator at Monticello. She says Jefferson was born into a culture dominated by slavery.
In America, in his time, 20% of all the population was enslaved. And Jefferson was one of those slaveholders. So coming to Monticello is an opportunity for people to think about this complexity.
STEIN and fellow curators wanted visitors to see the complete picture. So they decided to focus on Monticello slaves. Many of them lived and worked on Mulberry Row, the plantation's main street. A computer animation shows what the street looked like. Some of the slave homes and workshops will be reconstructed. Wormley Hughes was Jefferson's head gardener. He tended to his master's prized plants and trees.
Wormley Hughes planted seeds, bulbs, trees. He also dug the grave of his master, Thomas Jefferson, in July 1826. We're standing at the site of the original blacksmith shop.
Historian CINDER STANTON learned about Hughes and other slaves from Jefferson's extensive records. But for Stanton, that was not enough. Almost 20 years ago, she and a colleague began an oral history project to identify the descendants of Monticello's slaves.
It's a way of seeing how the institution was cruel and oppressive, but within that institution, people were able to make valuable lives and pass on values and skills to their children.
Wormley H. Hughes.
Karen Hughes White is a descendant of Wormley Hughes. She collects artifacts and other objects related to slavery. White attended an oral history gathering at Monticello 15 years ago.
I learned where my ancestors walked. I learned where they worked. The tour was designed specifically for us, and we knew where we fit in the scheme of Monticello, the home of the president.
White says she has come to understand Jefferson.
I think he was a great founding father, but I also know that he enslaved many of my ancestors. So it's just learning about a time of history and acknowledging it for what it was and not trying to paint it one way or the other.
A second exhibit, presented by the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History, lists the names of every slave Jefferson ever owned on a huge wall. Rex Ellis co-curated the show.
That in order to see Jefferson clearly, you have to see him through the lens and through the eyes of his enslaved population. And even if only what we know about them is their name, it is significant.
Thomas Jefferson died on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and almost 40 years before slavery was abolished. He's buried here at Monticello, and several of his slaves likely rest here too, although in unmarked graves. Julie Taboh, VOA News, Charlottesville, Virginia.
This was pretty interesting, Alex. Definitely a part of Jefferson's life that we don't usually hear about.
Yeah, it was very enlightening, I think, to think about some of these conflicts that our founding fathers faced that are very similar to a lot of conflicts officials all over the world face today.